Hello. Hello, we're going to get started. Today we're doing chapter 38 in Genesis, but in real life, we're having Passover. This is the start of Passover this evening. And in the last few years, Chris and I have had the opportunity to enjoy Passover with our nephew and niece. So our niece is Jewish, and they've invited us to join their Passover celebration. But this year, enough people are still closed down. Well, I take that back. Last year we did it online, and the year before we did it in person. So we have enjoyed it and have appreciated it for what it represented. God saving the Jewish people from slavery and becoming their king and their God. But we also can appreciate the parallel that we see in Jesus Christ saving us from the enslavement of sin, that he frees us from that. And we can definitely see the parallel in the symbolism in the meal and the cup and the cup of wine and the bread and just everything. We can see him in it. So we didn't want to miss it this year. I don't think they're opening their home, and apparently they're not doing it online. I mean, they could be doing it. They just didn't invite us this year, which is fine. That's their business. But we're going to do it ourselves because we have enjoyed it. And we appreciate the tradition, and it is something that God has ordained. This is one of God's celebrations. This isn't man's celebration. This was one that God ordained. He said, I want you to do this to remember. And it's not just, I learned something today. When God says remember, he doesn't mean just like, oh yeah, I remember. It has to do with, how do I say it in a more deep manner? Kind of almost a reenactment to participate in that memory, that let it be more than just a fleeting thought. He wants you to ruminate, meditate, participate with that memory and make it your own. And that's what Passover is. Passover is a remembrance and a meditation and a participation, albeit symbolically, of what God has done for us. And what I really appreciate when Chris and I have done it these other years is that it's not reading about what happened to those people back then. The Jewish people nowadays relate to, that's what happened to us back then. They relate. This is part of us. It's not them and us. It's still us, even though there's a time frame. It didn't just happen to them. It happened to us. We're Jewish. They're Jewish. It happened to us. And that's one of the things I want to impress upon my Christian believers here, is that God did things for us, all of us, and now we participate. And as the body of Christ, it's us. If it happened to them in the year 100 AD, it happened to us. And that's the way God sees it. He really sees us without time. Time does not matter to God. We're the ones who are so linear from then to now. But God doesn't see it that way. He sees it more like one big family, and the time factor doesn't make any difference. So it happened to us, and it is happening to us. So that's something for us to remember. So anyhow, I tell you that to tell you that we're celebrating Passover tonight. We're making a few dietary substitutions that we feel comfortable with. And I did not clean my home of all the leaven, anything having to do with bread or flour or anything that you had to clean your house of. That's a Jewish tradition. But what it represents is clearing out sin, because leaven represents sin. And the idea was to remove all sin from your home. So we will go in prayer before and remember that God has cleansed us of our sin, and then partake of the Passover meal. So we're going to begin today with our Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6 declaration. We trust in the Lord with all our heart and lean not on our own understanding. In all our ways we acknowledge him, and he makes our paths straight. He will make our paths straight. All right. So, chapter 38. Now, remember, yesterday it was Joseph, and he was still a young man, but I think they said he was 17, and he was taken by his brothers and sold into slavery. And when he was taken by the dealers, he was then sold. The Midianites sold him to Joseph, sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar. Okay, so now he's one of Pharaoh's officials and the captain of the guard, and Joseph has been sold to him. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Isn't this interesting? Look at the time that's gone by. So this baby has grown up and become a man, and now he's found a wife for him. Her name is Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother. Now, do you know why that was important? You know, this brother died having had no children. And it was believed at that time with the Jewish people that unless you had a living descendant when the Messiah came, you were cursed, that you couldn't be saved. You had to have a living descendant when the Messiah came. And since he died without any children, that meant he wasn't going to have any descendants. And so that would have seen him as cursed. So the way you could get around it was to have your brother sleep with your wife, your widow. And if she had a son, then you were considered saved then because you had offspring. But so the father, Judah, said to Onan, the brother, lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. And what he did was wicked in the Lord's sight. So he put him to death also, because he wasn't willing to help his brother. I don't know if he had a grudge or what the deal was, but he knew that child wouldn't be considered his own, but he could have gone on to have more children. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. So he had a young son who wasn't old enough to come to her and be with her. And for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. After a long time, Judah's wife and daughter of Shua died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hirah, the Adullamite, went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. So she had waited a number of years at her father's house as a widow and was waiting for this younger brother to grow up. But he had grown up now, so it's been quite a few years. He'd grown up, and they still hadn't done right by her. I think it was important for her to have this offspring too. And so now she is disguising herself so that Judah what we'd say would be the grandfather, that the father of her husband, Judah, the father of her husband, won't know who she is. So let's see what happens. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face, not realizing that she was his own daughter-in-law. He went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked, and he said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord, and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. Boy, she was pretty tricky, wasn't she? And it's interesting that she asked for that stuff from him. Why do you think she did that? Well, she knew, I mean, she's looking for payment. She's a prostitute in this essence. She's behaving this way. She wants him to believe. He says, "Well, I'll send you something from my flock of sheep." But she's like, "You give me something until then," because she knows he's going to want his staff back. He's going to want his seal and his cord back. So he agreed to do that, and she became pregnant. So after she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, now what's interesting, lots of times we're finding women are getting pregnant quite easily. They just go sleep with somebody one time and boom, they're pregnant. They had a way of keeping track of what was going on in their cycles. They knew there was they were required to wait a certain number of days after their menses, and that number of days, if they were having a regular 28-day cycle and they waited 7 days, that would have brought them right to the point of being fertile. So it was very common for the women to become pregnant when they first had relations after waiting, because the husband would have been waiting after her cycle and plus the 7 days, and he would have been ready to go and had plenty of stock to fulfill his part of the duty, and she would have been ready as well. So it was very common for the women to get pregnant. If they weren't getting pregnant, that was an issue. So so that's why she would have gotten pregnant. And and who knows, God's hand is all in all this too. So meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend to the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where's the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said, there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Well, let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughing stock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." So he's found out that his daughter-in-law is in trouble. She was behaving like a prostitute and is pregnant, but he doesn't know by whom. Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said, and she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." And he did not sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. And as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. When his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, he was given the name Zerah. And let me look down below, because there is a little, Perez means breaking out, and Zerah means scarlet or brightness, because he had the red thread. Well, isn't that interesting? So she ended up having twins. I wonder what that represents. The two men who wouldn't sleep with her, I guess. No, her husband, they weren't able to have children with her husband. I don't know. That's an interesting little story. Kind of like, okay, here we're setting Joseph over here, and now we're going to go check out this story. Well, you watch any good series on TV or a movie, there's always more than one story going on. You're hearing about this story. And I think of Downton Abbey, you got the stories of the wealthy people who lived upstairs, and you got the stories of the servants downstairs, and there's always something going on. This is kind of like that. You've got more things happening while Joseph is off in his enslavement. There's things going on here with Judah and Tamar. Very, very, and a good bit of time's going by, so it's a long side story. But tomorrow we get to go back to Joseph and find out what's going on. So, that is interesting. We'll have to think about that some more. See if I can find out some more information. But at least he didn't have her killed for that, because he could see that it was his own fault that she was so desperate to have that. He hadn't fulfilled his duty towards her. So she made it happen through him. That's interesting. Through her father-in-law. At least it wasn't her father. All right, you guys. That's it for today. Happy Passover, and tomorrow's Palm Sunday. Happy Palm Sunday. And happy spring. We're changing seasons, thank goodness, and heading into light. We've got sunshine today. It's been cold, but at least the sun's out. And that does make all the difference. So I pray for you to be blessed this weekend. And let me give you this prayer again. We trust in the Lord with all our heart and lean not in our own understanding. In all our ways we acknowledge him, and he will make our paths straight. God bless you and have a good weekend. We'll see you tomorrow.